Good to see all of you tonight. We are in the book of Isaiah. We've been working through our study of this book for a few weeks now. We're not necessarily in a hurry, but we are kind of looking at big picture kind of approaches, and we're not necessarily getting bogged down. If we can help it at times to kind of stay fluid in our study of the book. But is there things come up or questions that you have? Don't let me deter you from that. I'm not trying to speed read through Isaiah. I'm just kind of taking an approach that I think can get us through the book in a reasonable amount of time. But I'll be glad to stop and answer your questions or listen to the thoughts that you might have that I might not necessarily emphasize through the various texts and pieces of the outline that we're going to look at. And again, I gave you outlines for your own personal study use. We'll use the questions at the end of those as we get to them in our study. But I'm giving you something far more condensed that you see on the screen as it relates to our study together. And we're about verse 24 as he's been working through this narrative here in chapter 25 of the book of Isaiah. And he really just before this gave them a series of what? What's the woes, right? He gave them a series of woes. Woe unto you, because of here's these conducts and behaviors and choices that they had been involved in for a period of time. And so he challenges them to think about those difficulties. And because of those woes that God pronounces to them or against them through the prophet, he talks about this judgment that is to come. And then when he talks about the severity, and that's kind of where we are here in verse 24, he said, "Therefore as the fire devoureth the stubble, and the flame consumeth the chaff, so their root shall be as rottenness, and their blossoms shall go up as dust, because they have cast away the law of the Lord of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel." And I think really the emphasis there we need to note is there's complete destruction coming, right? That's the imagery here. That everything will be consumed by Jehovah when he brings this judgment. But the more important maybe aspect of what he says there is the why. Why is that coming?
Because they rejected the law.
That's right. He said because you've rejected or you've cast away the law of the Lord and you've despised the word that he provides. If you had appreciated, wanted to honor, loved the testimony that God provided for you, you probably would not have casted it away, right? You would have embraced it and appreciated it and used it and allowed it to bring the benefit that it was intended to bring. But because they didn't like it, because they didn't appreciate it, because they despised the message, they just put it away from them. It's an easy way out, right? In some senses, at least on the surface, it appears to be an easy way out, to where if I just don't like what I'm hearing, I'll just put it aside. I'll just ignore it. If I don't like what God is sharing with me, I don't like what he's telling me to do or some instruction that he's offering to me, I'll just ignore it or put it aside. It may seem easy in the moment, but what happens afterwards? The judgment, right? The judgment of God comes against those who choose that kind of path. And so they may have, for a period of time, thought this was perfectly acceptable approach towards God, and they learned pretty quickly that it was not the wisest way to approach him. I want you to go and look with me in Acts chapter 13. And I want you to notice in verse 46 a parallel kind of problem in New Testament times, where here those in the days of Isaiah had cast away the testimony of God. They didn't love the law that he had instructed them in. It's exactly the same scenario that Paul and Barnabas find themselves in Acts chapter 13, isn't it? When Paul and Barnabas had waxed bold and said it was necessary that the word of God should at first have been spoken to you, to that Jewish population and to those in chief places. But seeing ye put it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. We brought you a message of hope and promise and salvation. We brought to you the message of the Son of the living God who put himself upon a cross to bring remission of sins and salvation. And what had they done with that message? You put it away from you, right? You rejected it. You put it away. And it's interesting, Paul and Barnabas, they very courageously, the text says, with great boldness, they say, your choice to make. In so doing, what had they done? What's the text say? Yeah, they judged themselves unworthy of everlasting life. What had Judah done? by casting away and despising the law and words of God. Same thing. They had judged themselves unworthy of the Lord, and because of that, His consequence comes and it's going to consume them. Verse 24 says as well. What I appreciate about these parallel kinds of moments is that, especially in Paul and Barnabas' case there in Acts chapter 13, the responsible party, and the same with Judah, the responsible party is the listener, right? The problem's never the message. The problem certainly isn't the Savior who provided that message and was crucified upon the cross to allow for that message to be presented. The problem doesn't rest with God or His purposes or plans. The problem rests with us, right? The problem rests with the listener. Will I respond? Will I adhere to it? Will I believe in it? Will I react to it? All of those things are going to be necessary if the testimony of God is going to be beneficial. And I don't think I'm overstating here. Paul and Barnabas said, listen, it was our duty to bring to you, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, it was our duty to bring to you this message first and foremost. But we're not going to just sit here and plead and beg and plead and beg and plead and beg. We're moving on. I've always found that to be kind of interesting, right? We brought you the message. You put it away from you. There's nothing left we can say to you. There's no alternative message. It's not like you can say, well, just give us something else. We didn't like that one. You have something else to. He said, you put it away from you. We're moving on to the Gentiles. And I think sometimes I don't see that as a mean-spirited kind of, it was just, there's nothing left. And sometimes I think we've got to learn that our responsibility and what we hope is people will respond to that message and adhere to it and find salvation and promise in it. But you can't force anybody, right? You can't make their decisions for them, and you can't force them to choose it. And Isaiah couldn't force Judah to change. Paul and Barnabas couldn't get the majority of those Jewish folks that they kept coming in contact with to change. But he wasn't going to manipulate or change the message, and nor was Isaiah in the process. Thoughts or questions you may have about that first step there in verse 24. Whoop, that's not where I want to go. So let's go back now and look at a couple more verses. Chapter 5, verse 25. Therefore, because you put the law away, because you've despised the word and testimony of God, therefore is the anger of the Lord kindled against His people, and He hath stretched forth His hand against them, and hath smitten them, and the hills did tremble. And their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. For all this His anger is not turned away, but His hand is stretched out still, and He will lift up an ensign to the nations from far, and will hiss unto them from the end of the earth, and behold, they shall come with speed swiftly. And so this judgment that God's bringing against Judah, who's He going to use to make that happen? Babylon. Right? He's going to use Babylon, and in more general senses, He's going to use people, right? Other people. He's going to use another nation in order to accomplish that. And so, just in case they think it's not possible, He said God is going to wave a what? A flag, right? An ensign. He's going to wave a flag. He's going to signal to these other nations, I'm stepping away from my people. You're free to come. I'm taking away that hedge of protection. I'll signal those places, those nations from far off. I'll hiss. I think that's not a jeering thing. I think that's a signal as well. It's have you ever, and maybe you want to be careful doing this too, by the way, but if you're ever walking through Walmart and you're trying to get somebody's attention and you whistle, now that may get some negative attention sometimes. You may want to be cautious about that. But you know what I mean, right? You're trying to make a sound. The other day, I was down painting, helping some guys paint a football field the other day, and we wondered whether Brent would come over and help us, and so we were hollering across a fence at an old chant that Brent would know if we were yelling it from the football field over. He never did come, by the way. I don't understand that, but a signal, right? That's what God says. I'll send out a signal to these nations from far off, and they'll come. When I signal them to come, they'll come. The destruction's on its way, and they'll move swiftly, he said, to respond and react to that signal. And I think we can appreciate as well, God can call and choose what? Whomever he wants. Even other nations that don't necessarily or may not necessarily honor God in the moment. They may not even glorify him as God at the end of it all. Nebuchadnezzar for a while respected the fact that it was God empowering him to do all these things, but very quickly all that success and all that glory that went along with it went to his head pretty quick, and he kind of convinced himself that all that happened because he was really good and not because what God was doing for him, and God had to teach Nebuchadnezzar a lesson in relationship to those things. And so God's prepared, fully prepared, to get any and all involved in this process that he needs to bring this judgment against his people. None shall be weary, he says, nor stumble among them. None shall slumber nor sleep, neither shall the girdle of their loins be loosed, nor the latchet of their shoes be broken, whose arrows are sharp, and all their bows bent. Their horses' hoofs shall be counted like flint, their wheels like a whirlwind. Their roaring shall be like a lion. They'll roar like young lions. Yea, they shall roar and lay hold of the prey, and shall carry it away safe, and none shall deliver it. And in that day they shall roar against them like the roaring of the sea. And if one look unto the land, behold darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened in the heavens thereof. And so what God wants them to appreciate is the power that this army, this judgment, and these nations that he will call to bring judgment against Judah, the power in which they'll do that. They won't break any shoestrings, right? That's the impression. Their boots won't ever become unlatched. Their arrows will always be what? Sharp, right? Imagine that. You just continue to, and God's like, they'll never dull in the process of bringing this judgment against my people. The sound of them will roar, not no offense to those who are older, but not like an old horse lion, right? One that's been strained for a while. No, like the what, he said? The young lion, right? That vibrant, youthful lion. And that sound that will come, that roaring as this judgment comes upon God's people. And it's interesting that God, through Isaiah, wants his people to appreciate that you're powerless. When God determines this is what I'm going to do, you're powerless. And the people that are coming against you won't have any restrictions whatsoever. In fact, the things that they'll do and the tools that they'll have at their dispense will never diminish. You're not stopping when God decides to bring this kind of judgment. Go ahead, Amy. Right? They when they trusted God and honored his will and listened to his law and were guided by his word, that was them. That was the nation they were that others cowered in fear of because of the power that they had and the God that they served. Once they determined it was more about them than it was about God, now the course has changed. That's a good thought. Anything else you thought of about chapter 5? If you look at those questions in real quick, we'll use those to kind of summarize chapter 5 before we move into chapter 6. So at the beginning, what did he do? He sang a song, right? The beginning of chapter 5, it seems like 5 weeks ago we were talking about that, but I think it was only 3. But anyway, he sang this song, and at the beginning of the song, it sounded what? Yeah, positive, right? Talk about the glory of God and how wonderful God is. But then it turns. And it becomes about Judah and what about them? How they had what? How they had squandered it all, right? Here's this wonderful, glorious God that had been blessing them and honoring them, and you all just squandered it away. You didn't do anything in respect to that benefit. Upon whom then are those woes to come? Well, generically, it's Judah, right? All of Judah. And in specific, whom? Yeah, the men there, we already had a conversation about, or in an earlier chapter, about all the daughters of Zion, right? And so you see Isaiah deal with the various aspects of all of the challenges that the nation had been suffering in. So in summary, what was the reason for their impending judgment in verse 24? That's what we talked about tonight. Yeah, rejection of the law, and they despised the word and testimony of God. Therefore, the judgment is coming. How was the Lord's anger then aroused against his people? That question, huh? Right. I'm going to consume you, right? From the stubble to the root, I'm going to come and consume. And I'll use and call for other nations to come and bring this judgment against you, and I'll supply them with everything they need in order to fulfill that. And there was no turning God from that. Leftover thoughts or questions you had about chapter 5? Okay, let's jump to chapter 6. Let's take a look at chapter 6 for a little bit tonight. And if you recall, his prophecy spanned how many kings? 4, right? There were 4. Where did Uzziah fit in that chronology? Is he the first one? I think you're right. I believe because it's Uzziah and who else? Jotham, Ahaz, right? And who was the 4th? Okay, right? Say it again, Ken. I believe, yes, Hezekiah is the 4th. I think that's, I think we got all 4 of those in. Sometimes when you're throwing them at me from different parts of the room, it's hard for me to remember which ones you said. But here's this. So during that time period of Uzziah, he says, in the year that King Uzziah died, in fact, he says, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 or 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. So you see this seraphim, and that each of them had 6 wings. 2 of the wings covered their face, 2 of their wings covered their feet, and then they flew with the other 2. Now, I'm not trying to say that his descriptive language of this seraphim is insignificant, because it's recorded for us, right? So if it's recorded for us, it's significant. It's important that he's sharing that with us. But we can get all caught up in, well, what kind of creature is that? And what kind of wings were those? And how could a creature have 2? And we'll miss what? We'll miss the point. Here's the point. The one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, and the whole earth is full of his glory. And while it spake, the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Some interesting symbolic kind of descriptions, right? Similar to what other 2 basic writings that we generally think of when you get into that kind of language. One in the Ezekiel in the Old Testament and Revelation in the New. You see those kinds of descriptive languages. And just as those books, we have to be careful that we don't get all consumed by circles that encircle other circles, right? That's Ezekiel. And you're trying to figure out which, and one turns this way and one turns that way, and this wheel within a wheel and all that. And then we miss, though, because we're trying to figure all the picture out, we miss what's happening among those symbols. And what's happening, Isaiah, as he describes what he saw, he wants to emphasize, though, what he heard. And what he heard was the voice of one of them saying, or one to another saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, and the earth is full of his glory. And while they were doing that, the posts of the door moved, and the house was filled with smoke. The emphasis is there, right? And this glorification of God. Judah would not glorify the name of God. Judah had every reason to be declaring and singing with loud voice, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God. The earth is full of his glory. They had every reason to be singing that, refused to, because they've put aside God. When Isaiah sees this seraphim, it's doing what it ought to be doing. It's praising and honoring with this powerful voice the God of heaven. So the symbolic, picturesque kind of moment with Isaiah here starts interesting, right? With this great voice of this seraphim as they speak one to another, as they glorify the name of the Father. But then said I, woe is me. So Isaiah sees it, he hears this, posts of the doors shake, smoke fills the room, and this is his reaction. Then said I, woe is me. Who had been the woes upon before? That's on Judah, right? The people. He'd been describing woes and pronouncements of woes upon the people. This moment has humbled him. Woe is me, for I am what? I'm undone, right? Because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah is humbled by the experience. And when he recognizes the glory that he's just been exposed to and the tremendous nature of this voice glorifying the holiness of God within this vision, his reaction isn't, wow, what an experience I'm having here, or look what God has shown me. His reaction is, I don't what? I'm not worthy of this. Woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live in a nation of unclean people. I'm not what I need to be, and nor are the people of this land of Judah what they need to be. I'm unworthy of this experience. And yet, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. He has this very personal experience with the Lord. And as he's saying this, within this kind of vision language, as he says that, one of the seraphims flies to him. And he's got a live coal in his hand, meaning what? Right, it's hot, right? It's hot. Not it's got, eyes and it's hot. It's alive, it's hot. So he takes this hot piece of coal, the text says, in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. So we add an additional scene here, right? So we initially see these seraphim, 6 wings, 2 over the face, 2 over the feet, 2 to fly. Isaiah is present there, and now you've got an altar added. And an altar would be for what purpose? For worship, and particularly for sacrifice, right? And so you've got this altar for sacrifice, and so and generally their sacrifices were what kind? And they were burnt, right? They were burnt offerings most often. And so you've got this coal from this burnt offering, this sacrifice, that should have been in glorification and in honor of the Lord. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. So again, it's vision form. And within the vision, Isaiah within it. A lot of times when you see symbolic and vision kind of language, you kind of see the one telling about it is kind of seeing it, not necessarily experiencing it. But Isaiah seems to be kind of within it, right? Ezekiel's that way sometimes. He's kind of within it. And so he's in contact with this, within the vision, with these seraphim. And they come and bring this hot coal, and they put it against his mouth and say, basically, stop talking. The Lord has taken away your iniquity, and your sins have been purged. His humility was the proper response to such a scene, and the purging of his sin because of his humility is what comes from Jehovah. It reminded me a lot. I don't know whether you guys thought of any other text that it might have sounded like. This is the text that came to my mind when I thought of that language about purging of sin and one accepting some accountability for their actions. And it's Psalm 51. It's Psalm of David, right? In fact, at the beginning of the Psalm, it tells us and gives us, we don't always get this. Sometimes you got to kind of figure out, if you can, why the psalmist wrote what they wrote, what's going on in their life or in the time period. Not with this one. We know what's happening here. To the chief musician, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came unto me at him after he had gone into Bathsheba. Very, very specific. We know exactly why David writes this. This is right after Nathan the prophet had to go tell him, thou art what? Thou art the man, right? He uses that parable, and he says, David says, you tell me who that guy is that would take another man's pet lamb and use it for dinner. So you tell me that guy is, I'll strike him down. And Nathan the prophet rather says, it's you. You're the man. Story's about you. So David, humbled by it, right? He's humbled by it. And he says, have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Isaiah wants that iniquity turned away and taken away. David wants that iniquity cleansed me from my sins. Wash me thoroughly, there, verse 2. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee, thee only have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. That text seemed to me to be the kind of humility that Isaiah is trying to demonstrate as well. David had to kind of get there a different way, right? Isaiah kind of has that moment when he realizes, I'm not worthy to be in the presence of the Lord. And these beings that are surrounding him, glorifying him, holy, 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 right? But the seraphim comes and purges him of that guilt and that sense of disconnect. And I noted, and you can see it on the screen, that when we're purged of sin, it should provoke a response from us. Forgiveness of sins shouldn't just be, yay, I don't have that on my account anymore. The forgiveness and pardon of sin, the remission of sin should provoke and present unto us a desire to want to do right and to honor God and to serve Him and to respect Him and to bring that kind of benefit unto Him. And I thought I'd written one more thing down. I apologize, but you just love Isaiah's approach towards recognizing that humility is the beginning place. And then once that forgiveness has been extended and found, then I want to serve. I want to honor God. And we're going to see that in a minute in the text. But you got to purge to serve. And I think that's the part we miss. Sometimes we try to serve God without purging the thing that's hindering our service to God. The iniquities and sins in our lives, those are the things that are hindering our service to God. And so many times folks try to serve Him without purging first. They want to hold on to the sinful behaviors and try to serve God on the other side. It just doesn't work. And with David, purge me with hyssop, right? Cleanse me of my sins so that I can humble myself before you and serve you. And then and Isaiah is the same way. I don't deserve to be in the presence of you. I don't deserve this vision. And the purging of sin comes in order to allow him to start honoring God. Also I heard, he said, the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And what's Isaiah say? Yeah, here am I, send me. That's where that comes from, right? Well, sometimes we forget. We hear that phrase. We even have a song in our song book, I think, that's here am I, send me, Lord, send me. And we sing that sometimes. And that's where it comes from. This concept that Isaiah presents here that the Lord's asking for somebody. Who can go? Who can step up and go and serve the Lord? And Isaiah says, I'm right here. Send me. It's a little different than what I was reminded of, and then my brain kind of went, no, it's actually kind of the opposite in some ways. But it reminded me of Moses, right? The difference is Moses said what initially? I don't want to go, right? Moses and men like Jonah as well said, I don't want to go. Moses kind of had to be guided and led and shamed in some ways to make sure that he realized that God had chosen him for that purpose. What I love about Isaiah is he hears the voice of God. Who can go and serve me? And Isaiah says, I could serve you. Send me, I'll do that. And I think it's in thankfulness in some ways of this forgiveness, this purging that he's just experienced, and this within this vision that he has, and he takes that natural progression into service in appreciation for what God had blessed him in.
It was important for Isaiah.
It helps Isaiah appreciate that his service is about glorifying the holiness of God, not his own holiness and his own merit, and relates to that. But it is important that he comes to terms with that as he sees this vision. So he said in response, here am I, send me, is what Isaiah says. God's response, the Lord's response, and he said, go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and convert, and be healed. And then said I, Lord, how long? And he answered, until the cities be wasted without inhabitant, and the houses without man, and the land be utterly desolate, and the Lord have removed men far away, and there be a great forsaking in the midst of the land. It sounds a lot like John 12 if you look at it. If you run over and look at John 12, verse 30, in fact, John 12 actually in verse 38 will reference Isaiah. In John 12, beginning in verse 37, but though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him, speaking of Jesus. And that the saying of Isaiah, or Isaiah in the King James there, the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, because that Isaiah said, again, he hath blinded their eyes, hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I shall heal them. These things said Isaiah when he saw his glory. And that very scene that we're reading about in Isaiah chapter 6, he said these things. John's recording that. He said these things when he saw the glory of the Lord. He spoke them. Nevertheless, among the chief rulers Also many believed on him nevertheless among the chief rulers also many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him lest they should be put out of the synagogue. And so you see that very similar language. In fact, not just similar, it's direct connectivity between the things that Isaiah talked about in Isaiah chapter 6 and the reaction when John records that, and he reminds people that this is the very same kinds of issues that Isaiah had to address in his day. In what way would God harden anybody's heart, by the way? Okay.
He didn't actually harden the heart. He did things that he knew.
So, the hardening in Pharaoh's an example of that similar kind of thing. In what way does that happen? And I think, and you think about all that together, when God says, here's what I desire from you, here's my law, here's my word, here's my testimony, and they don't want to do it, they've got two options, right? They can either repent and do it, or they can just get more and more callous to what God is saying. He didn't say, okay, here are the 10 people that are going to have hardened hearts, and here are the 10 people that are going to have soft hearts. He may have knew the kind of heart that they have, but he's not forcing anybody to do anything. He's hardening their heart just like anybody might respond to something you're trying to encourage them in. Now, you or I might try to encourage somebody to appreciate something, and each time we talk about it, they seem to get further and further and further away from it. They harden their hearts more and more and more. It happened in the days of Isaiah. It happened in the days of Barnabas and Paul. It happens. For whatever reason, some decide that the very same message that leads people to God, for some, is the very same message that lets them harden their heart to that very same thing. And it was going on in the days of Isaiah as well. And finally, in verse 13, but yet in it shall be a tenth, and it shall return, and I can't even speak, and shall be eaten as a teal tree, and as an oak whose substance is in them when they cast their leaves, so the holy seed shall be the substance thereof. And so he ends with what we've heard repeatedly, right? What is it? There's a remnant. There's a remnant. And God's always going to have that. There's always going to be this remnant of people who desire the righteousness of God rather than the consequences that iniquity and sin tend to bring. Last minute thoughts, questions you may have about chapter 6. And we'll try to work together a little bit as we work through the book. I might start taking more chunk approaches to it and maybe look at less verse by verse, as we kind of now have this image, right? We kind of now know what it is that we are learning from these things, but it'll eventually there'll be some redundancy and some repetitiveness to it that we won't necessarily have to spend the exact same amount of time on as we work through. Who's the holy seed, by the way? Yeah. So the holy seed shall be the substance thereof. Ultimately, and there may be a little bit of messianic view in his final thought there, that the great promises that God has made. I'm going to close there. Rather than speed read through the questions, we'll come back to the questions for chapter 6. Lord willing, next Wednesday, we'll start with those as a review, and then we'll jump into chapter 7.